Hey guys, welcome back. We're back outside today and we are tackling some overdue maintenance in the garden, and we are going after some of these weeds that have taken over my garden. But I'm using the term weeds a little tongue in cheek right now because really, what is a weed? I'm actually really trying to stop using that term because as I'm learning more, I realize weeds are mostly things that are native plants that are growing in places or growing more aggressively than we would maybe like. Or we also maybe don't find them as beautiful or maybe as useful as some of the plants that we're intentionally planting in our gardens. But the truth is, a lot of these plants are native plants and have a purpose to the ecology that we have outside and are therefore beneficial to us as well. So, since on this channel we're trying to get a little bit wilder and plant with more native plants and basically make our gardens more beautiful while still keeping nature in mind, I didn't want to start taking these plants out of the ground when they first started coming up because I didn't know what they were. And I didn't know if it was a native plant, if it was an invasive plant. So I let them get a little bit bigger and a little bit more prolific than I maybe will in the future. But I started using an app. Actually, I've been using it for some time now. This app called Picture This, which has been really helpful for me in helping me determine whether something is a plant that us gardeners consider weeds or an invasive plant and then needs to be ripped out of the ground. So, for example, what you see me pulling out of the ground here now is something called American burnweed. This is a plant that's native to the United States, particularly the Northeast. However, it is something that is often considered a weed by gardeners. But what this app is making me realize is that it's not a weed, it's just a plant that we don't like. So, what you're going to see me doing throughout this video is I am taking a good amount of them out, but I don't take everything. Now, plants that are invasive, such as the crabgrass that I just picked up, that aren't really supposed to be here, I rip those out of the ground without any mercy. So those things, if it's something that's invasive, I take it out, I don't have any mercy. However, something like wood sorrel, which I found I have a lot of in my garden, is also something that's often considered a weed, but again, it's a native plant and this one doesn't bother me so much. I'm going to be taking out most of the American burnwood, partially because this plant actually gets very tall. I mean, it can get past 5 feet tall, and there are a lot of them in the garden. So I do take out most of them, but I leave a couple of them. And truthfully, guys, except for the invasive plants, I really wasn't going for perfection here. I figured it would be okay if I left some of these plants because, again, they have a purpose. As I was working in this front garden bed, there was a giant locust on one of the American burnweeds, which scared me, I'm not gonna lie. And I also had to Google what it was because I had no clue. But she was hanging out on the burnweed, and I don't know if she was laying an egg or I don't know what she was doing. But I avoided her, and that's why you'll see there's this patch of burnweed over here that I end up leaving because I didn't want to bother the locust. One of the most common weeds I have in my garden, which I've mentioned in a previous video, actually are tomato plants. They are all over the place. I do take a good amount of them out, but I left a few because they had some tomatoes on them, which we've already eaten and we're good. So there's tomato plants that I think you could easily consider a weed because they are growing in places where I didn't mean to plant them, but a seed somehow got dropped there. So there's one in this garden bed, as a matter of fact, that I ended up taking out. And one of the most common weeds I have in my garden, I realize, are trees. I had to take out a few mulberry trees that we're trying to start, as well as some oak trees. I assume that's courtesy of my local squirrel gang. So the next thing you see me taking out here is horseweed. Now, this one is interesting because as you can see on the app, it says that it's invasive in parts of the United States, but when I looked at the map, it's actually native where I am in New York in the Northeast. So this is another plant that I did take out a good amount of it, but I left some of it because it's not invasive in my area. It's not invasive in any of my neighboring areas. It's just a native plant that, kind of like the burnweed, grows very tall, but it's a native plant. And you can see in this clip, actually, I realize now, finally, guys, I have two monarch butterflies, at least that I've seen. You can see me checking this one out. She's kind of flying mostly around the milkweed, but again, as I was taking down these native plants, I saw wildlife activity, small insects, bees, bugs, different things that were utilizing these plants. Now, the next thing you're going to see me clearing out of this area is lady's thumb. This is another plant that's invasive in the United States and it's invasive in my area. So I took this out without mercy, and probably I ended up taking out some things that I maybe didn't need to. For example, in another minute, you're going to see me clearing out the area that's in front of one of the planters, right here actually. This area had a lot of my mom's evening primrose that she really liked, but I struggled to identify the lady's thumb from the evening primrose, and because I wanted to get the invasive plant out of my garden, I had to just pull everything out. So, part of the reason it took me so long to get after this project was, like I said, I wanted to know what these plants were before I just started taking things out of the ground. But then I also debated with myself whether I should be taking these native plants out the ground. I mean, just because I didn't want them there, did that mean they shouldn't be there? But then I realized that native plants, whether I put them in the ground or whether they grew themselves, like any other plant in the garden, I do, since it is my garden, have some right to edit my garden. As I'm cultivating and curating my garden, I can decide that a plant is too tall or maybe it's a little bit too prolific and it's smothering out another beneficial plant that I do want in my garden. So that's how I decided which plants to take out from where and how many of them to take out. If a native plant that we often consider a weed was smothering out other plants that I did want in my garden, I decided to clear that area out. If it was in a place that didn't really matter, it wasn't hurting anything, and therefore it could still achieve its purpose, then I left it alone. Like I said before, I'm not going for perfection here, but I did need a little bit more order because I did realize by letting some of these formerly called weeds take over, I was losing sight of some of the things that I was intentionally trying to curate, both for my own benefit as well as for the benefit of wildlife. So that's how I decided what to take out and how much to take out. If it was an invasive plant, it definitely came out, no questions asked. Everything else, I said pretty much everybody's equal in the garden. If you shouldn't be there because you're too tall or you're just being a little bit too much of a thug, then I'm going to take you out. But if you're in a place where you're not really bothering anybody and I'm not really gardening there, then I'll leave you alone. This next patch that you'll see me clearing out here is a good example. This is rhomboid mercury. It's native to North America, but it's commonly considered a weed. And it's probably because this thing is plurific. I feel like this is one of those plants where I saw some in the garden and they were there, and I came back a week later and all of a sudden it had exploded and they were everywhere. And this is one of those plants that was smothering out some of my other plants. For example, I had just planted some black-eyed Susans and some ironweed, I believe, in this area, and it was taking over. So this is one of the plants that I took out a bit more aggressively just because it seemed to be so prolific and is one of those plants that could very easily smother out other plants. But there's still some in the garden. Like I said, there's some in areas that I'm not really gardening in, and since it's not invasive, I just left it alone for the most part. Now, in just another minute, you're going to see me make a mistake. At this point, I was getting a little bit tired, and I think it's kind of like they say you shouldn't go grocery shopping when you're hungry. I think you shouldn't start editing your garden when you're feeling tired and impatient, because this plant that I'm holding here, I should not have torn out of the ground. You can see me looking back at it because I'm unsure. I thought it was more horseweed, but it's not. It's hairy aster. I'm not sure if I planted this. I don't think so, in all honesty. But either way, it's a native plant that I definitely wanted in my garden. Luckily, I realized there was more of it back there. I only pulled off one piece of it, and I did attempt to replant the piece that I had torn out of the ground. We'll see if it takes, but at least there's still some left. Lesson learned, be patient, and use your app if you're not 100% sure on the plant identification. So that's it for this video, guys. You're going to see some before and after clips of the editing we did in the garden. And I have to say, I really enjoyed this project. It's it was nice to clear out some of the space to see some of the new plants that I had planted earlier this year, see that they're actually taking and starting to grow and not being smothered out by some bullies. But this project also showed me that I need to be focusing on certain areas and certain garden planning. For example, there's going to be certain areas where I want to put pathways in the garden where I will probably put some stepping stones so that I can get to the back edge of the border to do some maintenance. I also need to cover the front of the bench because it would be nice to be able to sit on that bench and not have to go through a bunch of really tall plants. But like this area by the planter, what I realized is there were so many of those native plants growing there because I probably, there was a little bit of a vacuum. Not in that spot specifically because there was the evening primrose, but this project showed me that a lot of the plants were growing along my borders, along the edge of the border, or towards the back in areas where I hadn't really focused on putting plants in. And I heard someone say something like, nature abhors a vacuum, right? So if there's bare soil, something's going to grow there. So, what I need to do is focus on putting in more plants, more native plants, and more ground cover like plants in areas where I might want a little bit more control. So, thanks for coming along on this garden editing video with me, guys. And take another look at your garden and rethink some of those plants that you think are weeds. I bet there's more of them in there than you thought that you could probably leave in. So thanks for coming along, and as always, guys, I hope you get a chance to get outside and enjoy your garden. Until next time, bye!